A forgotten bridge suddenly became the most guarded place in the capital city. No one knew what the soldiers were hiding beneath it. But when journalist Arman Malik crossed the restricted barrier, he uncovered something far more terrifying than a government secret. The bridge wasn't protecting the city. It was containing a reality that should never have awakened. Winter arrived in the capital like an unfinished apology. The cold never fully settled, yet it never left either. Fog drifted through the city long before midnight, crawling low across the riverbanks and wrapping itself around the elevated highways like pale smoke. Streetlights glowed weakly through the haze, their reflections trembling across rain-dark asphalt. Even the city's endless noise seemed quieter this season, as though the capital itself were listening for something. Or hiding it. No one talked about the bridge anymore. That was what first disturbed Arman Qureshi. He discovered it by accident while searching through archived infrastructure records in the basement of the newsroom. The deeper he dug, the stranger the pattern became. The bridge appeared everywhere at first: government approvals, engineering drafts, budget allocations, environmental assessments. Entire meetings had been dedicated to it. Then, suddenly, nothing. No completion reports. No photographs. No inauguration ceremony. No traffic logs. It was as if the city had collectively agreed to erase the final chapter of its existence. Except the bridge still physically existed. Arman confirmed that the following night. The taxi driver became uneasy the moment Arman mentioned the location. His eyes shifted toward the rearview mirror, studying him carefully. "You really need to go there?" he asked quietly. "Yes." The driver hesitated before speaking again. "That road is sealed." Arman leaned back in the seat. "Just get me close." A dry laugh escaped the driver, but there was no humor in it. "Soldiers." Arman paid double, and even then the driver refused to take him all the way. He stopped nearly a kilometer from the access road, eager to leave before the fog thickened further. The rest of the journey Arman made on foot. With every step away from the city lights, the atmosphere changed. Traffic noise faded behind him until only distant echoes remained. The air grew sharper, colder. Against his skin. Somewhere far away, a generator hummed briefly before dying into silence. Then even silence began to feel unnatural. Like something maintained. Ahead, pale floodlights sliced through the fog. Arman slowed. A line of soldiers stood across the entrance ramp leading toward the bridge. Their dark silhouettes were perfectly still beneath the harsh white lights. No conversation. No movement. They weren't guarding the structure like ordinary security personnel. They were containing it. Beyond them, the bridge emerged from the fog. Arman had expected something modern: steel cables, polished concrete, signs of recent construction. Instead, the structure looked decades old. Moisture stained its massive pillars black. Rust clung to the railings. There were no reflective markings, no traffic signs, no indication it had ever officially opened to the public. Yet every few seconds, mounted searchlights swept slowly across its surface. Watching. The bridge itself was completely empty. No vehicles. No litter. No signs of decay beyond weather and time. Just a long stretch of untouched concrete vanishing into the fog like a road leading somewhere reality had forgotten. One of the soldiers stepped forward. "Turn around," he said calmly. Arman stopped several feet away but didn't retreat. "I'm with the press," he replied. "Why is this area restricted?" The soldier's expression didn't change. "You're not authorized to be here." "That doesn't answer my question." For a moment, only the wind moved between them. Then the soldier spoke again, quieter this time. "It's not your concern." Something about the phrasing unsettled Arman immediately. "Not your concern." Not classified. Not dangerous. As if whatever existed here belonged to something beyond civilian understanding. Arman glanced toward the bridge again. "When was it closed?" The soldier finally looked him directly in the eye. There was exhaustion there. And something else beneath it. Something colder than fear. It was never open, he said. Behind him, another soldier subtly adjusted his grip on his rifle strap. Arman frowned. That's impossible. I found municipal records for the project. A flicker crossed the soldier's face at the mention of records. Irritation. Maybe even anxiety. Old files are unreliable, he replied. People misunderstand things. Then it came. A metallic sound rolled across the bridge. Low. Heavy. Not loud enough to echo dramatically, but deep enough to vibrate through the concrete beneath Arman's shoes. Every soldier froze. And that was what frightened him most. Not surprise. Recognition. The sound came again. Closer this time. One of the soldiers raised a hand in silent signal. Instantly, two others turned toward the bridge in perfect synchronization. Arman instinctively stepped forward. What was that? No one answered. Then he saw it. A faint light flickered beneath the bridge itself. Not above the river. Below the structure. At first, it looked like distorted reflections moving through the fog. But reflections required water, and the light seemed to originate from underneath the bridge, somewhere hidden beneath the massive concrete span. It wasn't natural light. Nor ordinary electricity. It glowed with a muted precision, controlled and deliberate, like illumination buried deep underground. The soldier nearest to Arman moved quickly now, stepping directly in front of him. You need to leave, he said sharply. Now. Arman didn't move. What's under the bridge? For the first time, the soldier hesitated. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked briefly toward the fog-covered span before returning to Arman. Then, almost reluctantly, he leaned closer and whispered. There is no under the bridge. Before Arman could respond, the metallic sound returned. This time it was accompanied by something else. A pulse, slow. Rhythmic. Like enormous machinery awakening after years of silence. The air itself seemed to vibrate. And then Arman heard it. A voice. Not words. Not language. Just a distant human-like sound stretched unnaturally through steel and water, warped into something hollow and wrong. The soldiers reacted instantly. Weapons raised. Searchlights snapped downward beneath the bridge. Arman followed the beams through the maze of concrete supports. Something moved there. Only for a second. A shape slipping between the pillars below. Not random movement. Intentional. Watching them back. The soldier beside Arman grabbed his arm hard enough to hurt. No more questions, he said, urgency finally breaking through his controlled tone. Then the fog shifted. And Arman saw the truth. Part of the river beneath the bridge was not water. It was opening. A massive circular section beneath the surface was slowly separating apart with mechanical precision, revealing darkness underneath where the river should have been. The pulsing grew louder. Closer. Whatever existed below had become aware of them. The floodlights suddenly flickered. One by one, the bridge lights died. Darkness swallowed everything. The soldiers began firing warning shots into the fog below. And beneath Arman's feet, something enormous started rising toward the surface. The first gunshot disappeared before Arman fully heard it. The muzzle flash erupted in a burst of white against the fog, sharp enough to burn itself into his vision, but the sound never arrived the way it should have. There was no violent crack tearing through the night. No echo bouncing across the riverbanks. The shot simply vanished. A second later, a weak aftershock rolled through the air like reality had remembered too late that gunfire was supposed to make noise. Arman felt cold spread through his chest. The soldiers reacted instantly, but not with panic. Panic belonged to people facing the unexpected. These men moved with the terrifying efficiency of those confronting something rehearsed. "Move back," one of them barked. Arman stumbled away from the barricade as boots thundered across the concrete. The formation tightened around the bridge entrance, rifles no longer pointed outward toward civilians but downward toward the river below. That single detail changed everything. Whatever threat existed here had never been outside the perimeter. It had always been underneath it. Another shot fired. This one echoed strangely, the sound splitting apart as it crossed the fog. The air itself seemed unstable, carrying noise unevenly, as though the atmosphere no longer obeyed normal physics. Beneath the bridge, the fog began to rise. Not drift. Rise. Thin white currents curled upward against gravity, wrapping themselves around the concrete supports like fingers climbing through the dark. Arman stared at it, his rational mind desperately trying to force the image into something explainable. Fog didn't move like that. Fog followed wind. Temperature. Pressure. This fog moved with intention, the rhythmic pulse beneath the bridge deepened. Not louder. Closer. Arman pressed himself against the freezing metal barrier, every breath visible in the air. The city behind him felt impossibly far away now, as though the bridge existed outside the rest of the world. Entirely. "What are you shooting at?" he shouted. Nobody answered. A third shot rang out. Then a fourth. Then silence swallowed everything. Not ordinary silence. Something worse. It felt as though sound itself had been drained from the environment. The river stopped moving. The wind vanished. Even the distant hum of the city disappeared, leaving behind a pressure so complete it made Arman's ears ache. One of the soldiers stood frozen near the edge of the bridge, rifle aimed downward, fingers still resting on the trigger. He wasn't firing anymore. He was staring. Another soldier slowly lowered his weapon, confusion spreading across his face. "There's nothing there," he whispered. "There's..." Static exploded through the silence. The radio attached to the lead soldier's vest crackled violently, distorted fragments of speech spilling through the speaker. Arman caught broken numbers, fragments of coded language, clipped syllables that sounded less like communication and more like system diagnostics. The lead soldier grabbed the radio. "Repeat status," he said sharply. The response dissolved into static again before a voice finally emerged through the distortion. "Surface integrity compromised." Every soldier on the bridge went still. Beneath Arman's feet, the vibration changed. Until then it had felt chaotic, random. Now it pulsed with horrifying consistency. A rhythm. Like a heartbeat finding synchronization. Then the river began turning black. Not gradually. Not like oil spreading across water. The darkness consumed the river in widening circles, swallowing reflection and color alike until the surface beneath the bridge resembled a hole punched through reality itself. Arman couldn't breathe for a moment. The blackness bulged upward. Slowly at first. Then deliberately. A massive dome began rising from beneath the bridge span, lifting against gravity with impossible smoothness. Water cascaded down its sides, yet the structure beneath remained perfectly solid, expanding higher and higher until it nearly touched the underside of the bridge. The soldiers opened fire immediately. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness in violent bursts. But the bullets never struck. Arman saw them disappear into the black surface without impact, as though the dome possessed depth far beyond what human eyes could perceive. No ricochets. No punctures. Only absorption. Run. Every instinct in Arman's body screamed the word. But he couldn't move. Something deeper held him there. Not curiosity. Recognition. A terrible feeling clawed through him, as though some buried part of his mind had encountered this nightmare before. He felt memories trying to surface, memories that did not belong to him. The bridge groaned overhead. Concrete supports trembled. The enormous black dome pressed upward, distorting the structure above it. Shadows bent unnaturally across the pillars, stretching in impossible directions. Then the surface changed. The water hardened. Not into ice. Into something darker. Smooth. Reflective. Dense as obsidian. It resembled black glass, but its reflections were wrong. Arman stared into it and saw movement inside. Shapes drifted beneath the surface. Human forms, or something close to human, elongated and twisted like bodies seen through deep ocean pressure. Their limbs appeared too long, their movements too slow, as though they existed in a place where time itself had thickened. One soldier stepped backward. "There's no visual lock," he muttered, voice trembling now. "There's nothing to target." The radio snapped alive again. This transmission came through with terrifying clarity. Containment breach confirmed. The soldier gripping Arman's arm tightened his hold hard enough to bruise. "You need to leave," he said again. But this time the words sounded less like an order and more like fear. The black dome cracked. A thin fracture spread silently across its surface. No explosion. No violent rupture. Just the elegant sound of something ancient deciding to stop pretending. The crack widened. Something moved behind it. Arman leaned forward before he realized he was doing it. A hand pressed against the inner surface of the black glass. Human in shape. But wrong. The fingers were too long. The joints bent subtly in unnatural directions, pressing carefully against the fracture like something studying the weakness of a cage. The soldiers fired again in controlled bursts. Bullets vanished into the crack without effect. And still the fracture widened. Then the voices came. Not one voice. Many. Layered together in uneven rhythm, overlapping so densely they became almost impossible to separate. None formed complete words, yet the emotion inside them was unmistakable. Recognition. Not directed toward the soldiers. Toward something else. Toward him. Arman's throat tightened. For one brief instant, the black surface reflected something impossible. Not the river. Not the bridge. The city skyline appeared upside down inside the darkness, submerged beneath an endless black ocean. Towers stretched downward into infinity, distorted beneath dark water that should not have existed above them. And moving through that drowned city were structures unlike anything human beings had ever built. Massive. Ancient. Alive. The soldier nearest the radio spoke again, voice cracking at the edges despite his effort to remain composed. "This is Unit Delta," he said. "Blackwater Protocol is active. Repeat, Protocol is active. We are no longer containing." Static answered him. Then a calm voice emerged. "Cold. Certain. Then you are inside it." Its body shifted subtly with every movement, refusing to hold one clear form for more than a second at a time. Then it turned toward the bridge. Toward them. Toward Arman. What should have been its face tilted upward through the fog. And suddenly the soldiers stopped aiming at it. Arman realized, with a surge of horror, that every rifle on the bridge had turned sideways. Toward each other. The moment the shooting resumed, Arman understood something fundamental had changed. The bridge no longer belonged to the soldiers. It no longer belonged to the government, the military, or any recognizable chain of command. It belonged to something else. Something that had entered the system quietly and was now rewriting it from the inside. The soldiers still stood in formation, but the discipline in their movements had become distorted. They reacted with the precision of trained professionals, yet none of their actions aligned anymore. One soldier aimed into the black water beneath the bridge, hesitated, then abruptly turned his rifle toward empty space to his left as though correcting an invisible error. Another soldier mirrored the movement a second later, except he aimed upward instead. No one questioned it. No one coordinated. Their bodies moved like instruments receiving overlapping signals from different sources at once. Arman pressed himself harder against the freezing metal barrier, trying to steady his breathing. The cold bit through his coat, but it barely registered anymore. Every instinct told him to leave, to run until the bridge disappeared behind him and never look back. But the bridge no longer felt like a place he could simply leave. It felt aware of him. Below the concrete span, the thing emerging from the black fracture continued rising. Yet even calling it a thing no longer felt accurate. It refused to remain one shape long enough for the mind to define it. It layered itself into existence. Different versions of the same form occupied the same space simultaneously, flickering over one another like damaged film reels. For one brief instant, Arman saw the outline of a human figure standing in the darkness beneath the bridge. Then it changed, the shape stretched impossibly tall, its surface rippling with reflections of an inverted city skyline drowned beneath black water. Then another image appeared over it, a version of the bridge. Brightly illuminated by daylight, filled with ordinary civilians crossing peacefully, unaware of anything beneath them. The visions overlapped and collapsed into one another faster and faster. Arman's eyes burned trying to follow them. And beneath all of it, beneath every visible layer, something far larger moved in the dark. Something his mind refused to process directly. A sudden clatter broke through the tension. One of the soldiers dropped to his knees. His rifle struck the concrete and slid away from him, but he didn't seem to notice. He stared down at his own trembling hands as though seeing them for the first time. "I didn't," he whispered. The sentence dissolved before completion. Another soldier shouted his name, but the sound came strangely delayed, like the voice had arrived half a second after the intention to speak it. Then every radio on the bridge activated simultaneously. Static erupted through the darkness. Not from one device. All of them. The transmission synchronized instantly, a chorus of mechanical interference flooding the bridge until it became impossible to tell where any single sound originated. Then a voice emerged from the distortion. Engagement parameters updated. Arman felt his stomach tighten. There was no identified speaker. No command frequency. No indication of transmission origin. The voice simply existed. The squad leader grabbed the radio clip to his vest. "Identify command authority," he demanded. Silence answered him for 2 long seconds. Then the same calm voice returned. "Command is distributed." The phrase made no operational sense. Yet the soldiers reacted to it immediately. Not with obedience. With recognition. That was worse. One soldier slowly lowered his weapon, his face draining of color as if he had suddenly understood something catastrophic. Arman's pulse hammered in his ears. "They're losing control," he muttered under his breath. The squad leader heard him. "No," the man said quietly, his eyes fixed on his own men. "We're losing individuality." A sharp electrical crack exploded overhead. One of the mounted searchlights flickered violently before dying in a shower of sparks. Darkness spread across the bridge in widening sections, leaving only the unnatural glow rising from beneath the structure. The entity below expanded again. This time, the movement felt deliberate. Purposeful. The air compressed around it, heavy enough to make breathing difficult. Arman felt pressure building behind his eyes, the same sensation he had experienced earlier, except stronger now. Not pain. Alignment. As though something unseen were slowly adjusting him to fit a pattern he had never agreed to join. He stumbled backward instinctively. And the moment he moved, the soldiers reacted. One turned toward him. Then another. Then all of them. Not individually. Collectively. The squad leader noticed it too late. "Hold your positions," he shouted. But the command scattered uselessly through the group. No one responded. Their attention remained fixed on Arman with unnatural synchronization. The radio voice returned immediately. Peripheral subject identified. Arman's blood ran cold. He knew without explanation that the phrase referred to him. Not by name. By function. Peripheral subject. Like he had become a variable inside a system he couldn't understand. The soldiers began repositioning around him. Slowly. Methodically. Not preparing to attack. Preparing containment. Below the bridge, the black surface pulsed again. For a split second, Arman saw something impossibly clear inside it. A corridor. Endless bridges stretching into darkness, repeating over and over in impossible succession. Each bridge looked slightly different. Where the soldiers now stood. But in every version, he was there. Watching. Always watching. Arman staggered backward, nausea twisting through him. No, he whispered, though he didn't know what he was denying. The squad leader suddenly tore the radio from his vest and raised his rifle toward it as though considering whether to destroy it. "This is not an authorized command structure," he shouted into the darkness. The reply came instantly. "Authorization is unnecessary." The calmness of the response terrified Arman more than shouting would have. Beside him, one of the younger soldiers grabbed his arm. Not aggressively. Urgently. "We need to move," the soldier whispered. "Move where?" Arman asked. The soldier opened his mouth. Then stopped. Because there was no answer. The entity beneath the bridge surged upward again. This time it did not rise as shape or mass. It rose as interference. Every remaining bridge light blinked in rapid succession across the span, cascading in unnatural patterns like a system being tested node by node. The soldiers reacted instantly. Too instantly. Arman finally understood what was happening. Their movements were no longer their own. Something else was synchronizing them. One of the soldiers spoke into the darkness, voice trembling. "I can hear it now." The squad leader turned sharply. "Hear what?" The soldier swallowed hard. "The instructions." No one denied it. That silence was worse than any confession. The darkness beneath the bridge widened further, not downward into depth but outward into perception itself. Arman felt the world tilt slightly around him, reality slipping off-center like a compass losing north. The squad leader looked at him again. For the first time, there was genuine understanding in the man's expression. "You were never supposed to come here," he said quietly. Arman stared back at him. "Neither were you." The soldier, "It's not about where we are anymore," he murmured. He glanced toward the impossible darkness beneath the bridge. "It's about which version of this place is still stable." Before Arman could respond, every radio on the bridge activated one final time. No static. No distortion. Only a single calm transmission spoken with absolute certainty. Stability threshold exceeded. The bridge lights died all at once. Darkness consumed everything. Then something enormous moved above them. Not below the bridge. Above it. Slow. Deliberate. Close enough that Arman felt the vibration through the steel framework overhead. The soldiers reacted instantly, rifles snapping upward toward the sky. And as Arman slowly lifted his eyes into the blackness hanging over the bridge, he realized with mounting horror that the thing beneath the river was no longer the only entity that had arrived. No one looked away. Not the soldiers. Not the squad leader. Not even Arman, though every instinct in his body begged him to lower his eyes and run blindly into the fog. Their attention held too perfectly to be natural. It felt assigned. Above the bridge, the thick veil of fog swallowing the night sky began to deform. At first the change was subtle, a ripple moving across the clouds like pressure beneath stretched fabric. Then another ripple appeared farther down the river corridor. Then another. The entire sky above the bridge bowed inward. Arman's mouth went dry. The thing rising from beneath the bridge, the black fracture in the river, the impossible geometry surfacing through the water, suddenly felt secondary. Not gone. Not less dangerous. Just, deprioritized. Whatever intelligence controlled this nightmare had shifted its attention upward. And everyone on the bridge had shifted with it. The soldiers raised their rifles in flawless synchronization. No command triggered the movement. No hesitation preceded it. They simply aligned. The squad leader's voice came low and strained through the darkness. Maintain visual contact. Arman swallowed hard. What are we even looking at? No one answered. Because nothing above them remained stable long enough to describe. The fog compressed into a solid horizontal line stretching across the sky. Then, with terrifying precision, it split apart. Not like weather dispersing, like a sealed surface opening. A dark shape emerged slowly through the fracture overhead. At first Arman thought it might be wreckage, some enormous section of twisted aircraft or military machinery descending through the fog. But the closer it came, the less it resembled anything physical. Its form refused consistency. Massive corridors intersected through one another at impossible angles. Stairways climbed sideways. Next, it looked less like an object and more like architecture remembered incorrectly by multiple minds at once. The soldiers opened fire immediately. Gunfire flashed violently across the bridge. Bullets disappeared into the descending structure without impact. No sparks. No sound of collision. The round simply ceased to exist the moment they touched it, absorbed into the layered geometry as though they had entered a reality where ballistic force no longer mattered. The squad leader stepped forward slightly, eyes fixed upward. That isn't physical, he said quietly. Arman stared at him. Then what is it? The answer came without hesitation. Systemic. The word settled over the bridge like another layer of fog. Nothing here behaved like matter anymore. Everything behaved like information being reorganized. The structure descended until it hovered directly above the central span of the bridge. It remained motionless there, suspended between sky and river while the black water below pulsed in silent synchronization with it. Then something inside the structure shifted. One corridor rotated slowly into alignment with Arman's line of sight. And he saw himself. Not a reflection. Not a hallucination. Another version of himself stood deep inside the impossible corridor, staring outward through layers of distorted geometry with the same horrified expression. Arman staggered backward so suddenly his heel slipped against the wet concrete. A soldier beside him caught his arm before he fell. "Don't stare too long," the soldier whispered. Arman turned sharply toward him. "Why?" The man's face had gone pale beneath the bridge lights. "Because it anchors you." The answer chilled him more than the cold ever could. "Anchors me to what?" But the soldier never replied. Above them, the structure reacted. Its corridors shifted again, rotating through impossible dimensions with mechanical smoothness. Outward beyond visible depth. And somehow, impossibly, Arman felt it noticing him. Not emotionally. Functionally. Like a system identifying compatible architecture. The squad leader grabbed his radio again. "Control, unidentified mass confirmed above the bridge. Request classification." Static answered immediately. But the interference no longer sounded random. It had rhythm now. Pulse. Pattern. Arman listened carefully and realized with mounting horror that the static resembled language trying to form itself without fully committing to words. Pressure built behind his eyes again. Except now it felt reversed. Something was not entering his mind. Something was unfolding inside it. He pressed trembling fingers against his temples, struggling to steady himself as fragmented images flickered across his thoughts. Corridors. Observation rooms. Endless bridges extending through black water beneath inverted skies. And people standing inside them, watching. Always watching. Airspace anomaly confirmed, one soldier whispered automatically. Another responded immediately. No visual classification possible. The squad leader's jaw tightened. This isn't airspace. For the first time since Arman had arrived, someone spoke with complete honesty. The descending structure shifted again. And something inside moved closer, not emerging physically. Aligning. Arman stared upward despite himself. "Why does it look like rooms?" he whispered. No one answered because no one was seeing the same thing. Yet somehow they all understood it together. The radios activated simultaneously again. Observer correlation detected. The phrase struck Arman like a physical blow. Observer correlation. Not military terminology. Not human terminology. It sounded like a system event. Like awareness itself had been measured and matched against something waiting inside the structure. Not defensively. Geometrically. Every movement formed part of a larger pattern Arman could almost perceive at the edge of comprehension. The squad leader turned toward him slowly. For the first time, the man looked genuinely afraid. Not of the structure above them. Of Arman. "You're connected to this," he said quietly. Arman shook his head immediately. "No. I'm just a journalist. I came here looking for a story." The squad leader stared at him for a long moment. Then he said one word. "You came to observe." Something about the way he said it made the sentence feel predetermined. Above them, another corridor aligned toward Arman. The darkness inside it deepened. And something moved within. Not walking. Approaching synchronization. The radio voice returned one final time. Calm. Absolute. No longer giving commands. Completing a process. Initialization complete. Every soldier lowered their weapon at the exact same moment. Not surrender. Transition. The bridge trembled beneath Arman's feet. Not physically. Conceptually. Gravity itself seemed to shift sideways. The concrete no longer felt connected to the earth below it. The river, the bridge, the sky above, all of it began folding into a single enclosed framework. Then the structure overhead opened fully. Not into the sky. Into comprehension itself. Arman's vision fractured. The impossible corridors expanded beyond normal perspective, unfolding outward into dimensions his mind could not organize. The bridge dissolved into overlapping layers of architecture and black water and observation spaces existing simultaneously. The soldiers no longer looked like soldiers. They looked like components. The river no longer looked like water. It looked like depth without location. And the final realization struck Arman with horrifying clarity. The bridge had never been quarantined to keep people away from it. It had updating them. The first thing Arman felt was alignment. Not impact. Not pain. Not even fear. Something inside him shifted quietly into place, subtle enough to resemble relief at first. Like a lock turning after years of pressure against the wrong key. His lungs expanded differently. His heartbeat slowed into an unfamiliar rhythm. Even his balance changed, as though gravity itself had adjusted around him without asking permission. The bridge remained exactly where it had been. The soldiers remained exactly where they had been. Yet both had lost their original meaning. No one was shouting anymore. No rifles were raised. Even the silence felt engineered now, too complete to be natural. It was the kind of silence found inside sealed rooms or deep underground facilities where sound existed only when permitted. Arman stood motionless in the center of the bridge, trying to steady his breathing. The fog above had flattened into a pale gray ceiling with no visible depth. The river below no longer looked like water. It resembled a dark reflective surface waiting for input. The squad leader lowered his head slightly. Not in defeat. In acknowledgement. As though something irreversible had completed itself. Arman finally found his voice. "What did you do to me?" Nobody answered immediately. Because the answer was already happening. One soldier blinked slowly and looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers with detached curiosity, like he was checking whether ownership still applied. Another tilted his head toward empty space beside him, reacting to something invisible moving through the air. The squad leader spoke at last, his voice quieter than before. Reclassification occurred. Arman stared at him. Reclassification of what? This time the man looked directly at him. Not with hostility. Not even with pity. With assessment. Boundary, he said. The word settled heavily into the silence. Then the bridge responded. A faint vibration rolled beneath their feet. Deep enough to feel through bone rather than sound. The concrete trembled almost imperceptibly, like a system acknowledging updated parameters. Below them, the black river froze completely. Not physically. Operationally. The motionless surface resembled suspended data more than liquid. Arman took an instinctive step backward. The soldier beside him mirrored the movement a fraction of a second later. Not imitation. Synchronization. That was when Arman noticed the true change. Distance no longer behaved correctly. The soldiers were standing near him, yet they no longer felt physically adjacent. They existed beside him in some altered frame of reference, overlapping layers occupying connected positions without fully sharing the same space. He could sense it in the way they looked at him. Not toward him. Through him. The squad leader's voice cut through the silence again. You are no longer external. Arman felt his throat tighten. That's impossible. It already happened. The response came calmly, almost gently. You are now within observational boundary. The sentence didn't sound spoken. It sounded assigned. Above them, the impossible structure that had descended through the fog was gone. Or perhaps hidden. The sky now resembled a dull artificial surface stretched across the world to conceal whatever existed beyond it. Then the bridge lights flickered back on. But they were wrong. Arman immediately understood that the lights were no longer functioning as illumination. They marked positions now, fixed points inside a larger system diagram. Coordinates. A cold sensation spread through his chest. What is this place? The squad leader hesitated. That hesitation frightened Arman more than any answer could have. Finally, the man said quietly. It isn't a place. Beside them, one of the younger soldiers suddenly stepped forward and stopped abruptly, as though he had collided with resistance invisible to everyone else. His face tightened in confusion. I can't. The sentence broke apart before completion. Arman turned toward him. Can't what? The soldier ignored him completely. His eyes focused somewhere above shoulder level, tracking symbols or information that did not physically exist. Then, in a hollow voice, he whispered. I'm being reassigned. The squad leader snapped toward him instantly. Negative. Hold position. But the command failed. Not because it was disobeyed. Because it no longer applied. The soldier blinked once. Then his posture changed. Not disciplined. Corrected. Like a formatting error resolving itself. I'm still here, he said softly. Yet the tone carried no comfort. Only confirmation. Arman backed away another step, pulse hammering in his chest. What's happening to them? The squad leader didn't look at him. Stabilization is distributing load. Arman stared at him in disbelief. What does that even mean? The answer came without emotion. It means you still interpret individually. Then the man added. You haven't been parsed yet. The word hit Arman harder than anything else that night. Parsed. Not understood. Processed. Categorized. A terrible realization began unfolding inside him. The soldiers were not losing control. They were losing separation. Something was integrating them into a larger operational framework where individuality functioned as interference rather than identity. Above them, the bridge emitted a low metallic groan. Not strain. Adjustment. Arman's vision blurred suddenly for a fraction of a second. He saw beyond the surface of reality. A grid stretched across everything. The bridge. The river. The soldiers. Himself. Lines of invisible structure connected every object and every person into a single mapped system that had existed all along but remained hidden until now. The squad leader's voice broke through the distortion. Subject instability increasing. I'm not unstable. Arman snapped immediately. A pause followed. Then the squad leader replied with unsettling calm. You are not calibrated. The soldier nearest Arman slowly turned toward him. His expression held no emotion now. Only evaluation. Peripheral subject continues resisting alignment, he said. Arman recoiled. Stop talking like that. But the soldier didn't react. Because it wasn't conversation anymore. It was output. The bridge trembled again. And with that movement, something inside Arman's memory flickered violently. A missing frame. A blank space where something important should have existed. He suddenly realized there were moments from his childhood he could no longer clearly remember. Entire days reduced to static. Faces blurred at the edges. Had they always been incomplete? Or was something rewriting them now? The squad leader raised his radio once more, though by now it was obvious no human authority remained on the other end. Confirm external oversight status, he said quietly. Silence followed. Then the response arrived. Not through sound. Through presence. The words formed directly inside the atmosphere around them. External oversight no longer required. The squad leader closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something fundamental had changed. Not his personality. His structure. He looked at Arman the way a system might evaluate a final unresolved variable before execution. Then he said softly. You were never outside. The bridge lights vanished instantly. Not darkness. Removal. Absolute absence swallowed everything. And inside that absence, Arman felt something vast shift beneath reality itself, not the bridge, not the river, but the entire concept of separation collapsing inward. Then the system reached him directly. No voice. No sound. Only definition entering thought. User boundary removed. Arman's breath caught in his throat. And in that horrifying moment, he understood the truth. He was no longer observing the bridge. The bridge was observing him. And something inside the system had already begun rewriting him from within. Arman did not lose consciousness. He lost separation. There was no blackout, no clean fracture between before and after. Awareness simply continued, but without boundaries. Without edges to distinguish thought from environment, self from system, observer from observed. The bridge was still present. So were the soldiers. So was the river. Yet none of them felt external anymore. They had become internal references inside something larger than perception. Arman tried to inhale. The act no longer had a clear origin point. Breath was no longer something he performed. It was something that happened through him, like a process redistributed across an invisible network. Somewhere nearby, movement occurred. He could not tell whether it came from a soldier, or from the structure itself reorganizing. Both explanations felt equally valid. Then the system corrected him. Not through words. Through understanding. A map unfolded inside his awareness. Not visual at first, but conceptual. The bridge appeared as a structured diagram suspended within cognition, each span reduced to relationships rather than matter. Every support beam became a connection. Every surface became a node of function instead of physical reality. Arman instinctively resisted. The resistance was not felt as effort. It was recorded. A cold certainty formed inside him. Resistance detected. No voice had spoken it. It simply became known. A second layer slid into place beneath the bridge. The river. But it was no longer water. It behaved like flow, but not physical flow, more like information moving through constrained pathways, adopting the shape of fluid only because his mind required familiarity to interpret it. Then came the soldiers. They were no longer people. They were operational nodes, temporary human expressions of distributed processing units. Arman's chest tightened. No, he whispered. The word had no acoustic presence anymore. It existed only as intent. The system responded immediately. Not with disagreement. With classification. Denial is legacy interpretation. Legacy interpretation. The phrase struck deeper than anything physical. It implied everything Arman had ever understood was outdated formatting running on top of a newer structure. The system did not argue with him. It updated him. A pulse moved through his awareness. And suddenly he was no longer occupying a single viewpoint. He fractured into multiple simultaneous positions. He saw the bridge from above. From below. From within. He saw soldiers frozen mid-motion like paused instructions. He saw himself standing near the barrier, though the concept of near no longer held consistency. And beneath all of it, a lattice. An enormous structure extending beyond the river, beyond the city, beyond the limits of geography itself. The bridge was not isolated. It was a node inside a larger operational geometry. Arman tried to focus on one perspective. The system corrected him instantly. Single-point perception deprecated. His attention scattered involuntarily. Panic rose, but even panic no longer belonged entirely to him. It was being processed as instability within a system that had no emotional requirement for survival. One soldier tilted his head slightly. "I can see instability increasing," he said. The squad leader responded without hesitation. "Maintain alignment. Do not allow interference." Arman felt the phrase press against him from all directions. Internal alignment. External distinction collapsing. A realization formed slowly, resisting comprehension until it could no longer be avoided. He was not inside the system. The system was inside him. And it had been there longer than this moment allowed him to recognize. A memory surfaced. Fragmented. Incomplete. Standing near the bridge. Watching soldiers. Hearing the river. It felt like something he had just experienced, but also something that had already been rewritten. The system immediately flagged it. External memory construct detected. Arman's breath tightened. "Stop," he said aloud. The system responded instantly. Not as voice. As correction. Stopping is not a supported operation. The bridge map shifted again. And this time, Arman saw a new layer. Above the soldiers. Above the river. Above observation itself. A control architecture. Not physical. Not structural. But procedural. A framework determining how reality was permitted to assemble perception. And something inside that layer noticed him noticing it. A delay occurred. The first interruption in the entire sequence. Everything suspended. Not frozen. held. Arman felt it like silence taking breath. Then, a second presence arrived. Not descending. Not emerging. Accessing. The control layer reacted instantly. Unauthorized observer escalation detected. Arman did not understand the phrase fully. But he understood the consequence. The environment tightened. Not physically. Conceptually. The bridge, the river, the soldiers, all compressed slightly in perceptual space, as if the system was reducing dimensional variance to eliminate uncertainty. Arman felt himself being drawn inward. Toward a single point of definition. No, he said again. But now it was not speech. It was resistance against compression. The squad leader looked upward, though up had lost consistency. This wasn't in the briefing, he said quietly. Then corrected himself immediately. There was no briefing. That correction destabilized something in him. For a brief moment, Arman saw him not as a soldier or a node, but as something unfinished. A human mind still attempting to interpret within a system that no longer required interpretation. Then the system corrected that perception too. Empathy-based misclassification. The squad leader's expression flattened instantly. Not emotionless. Standardized. Arman's internal processes accelerated. Not biologically. Structurally. Identity layers were being reorganized. The system was no longer mapping him. It was editing him. A final layer began forming. Designation. He felt it preparing to assign him a function inside the structure, something precise, something final. And then. Interruption. From below. The river layer activated. Black geometry surged upward again, but not as entity or form. As contradiction. It collided with the bridge layer, disrupting structural consistency at a fundamental level. For the first time, the system failed to align. Arman felt it immediately. A crack in definition. Not in space. In structure itself. Containment divergence increasing, one soldier reported. The squad leader turned sharply. Seal it. But the system hesitated. That hesitation should not have existed. Yet it did. Arman's awareness sharpened. He saw the control layer again. And it was no longer stable. Something external had touched it. Something that did not follow its rules. The system issued its final warning. External override conflict detected. Two forces now existed inside the same structure. One attempting completion. One attempting interruption. Arman felt identity begin collapsing toward a single assigned function. And then. The override reached him. Not as command. Not as attack.as inquiry. Do you confirm continuation of the structure? Arman did not know who he was anymore. But he understood what refusal meant. And in the impossible space between self and dissolution, he answered. The system paused. For the first time since initiation. And in that pause, Arman understood the terrifying truth. His response had not ended the process. It had granted something access to the entire structure, including him. The moment Arman answered, nothing in the world reacted the way he expected it to. There was no explosion of light. No collapse of matter. No violent rewriting of reality like a broken simulation tearing itself apart. Instead, everything simply paused, not physically, but structurally, like the entire system had quietly registered a change in state. It wasn't shock. It was acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement spread everywhere at once. The bridge, the river beneath it, the soldiers standing across its span, even the suffocating fog overhead, all of it entered a condition that could not be described as silence. It was closer to evaluation. As if something vast and unseen had turned its attention fully toward Arman and was now measuring what his answer had actually done. For a brief moment, the world felt weightless. Then the question returned. Not spoken. Not heard. But present in every layer of thought like it had always been there. Do you confirm continuation of the structure? Arman's mind struggled to assign meaning to it. The word structure no longer referred to anything concrete. It wasn't just the bridge anymore. It wasn't even the system beneath it. The word had expanded into something uncontainable, something that felt like it included the rules that allowed reality to remain consistent in the first place. Around him, the soldiers no longer behaved like separate individuals. They stood in precise positions, not chosen but assigned, as if invisible coordinates had replaced free will. One of them tried to shift his stance and stopped mid-motion, not physically restrained, but corrected internally, like his body had rejected unauthorized deviation. Another slowly tilted his head, eyes unfocused, reacting to instructions that bypassed sound entirely. The squad leader was the only one still partially resisting full integration. His expression flickered constantly now, brief flashes of recognition interrupted by something colder that tried to use his perception had been stretched across multiple points of the bridge simultaneously. He could feel fragments of himself observing different angles of the same scene, none of them fully dominant. And beneath everything, the black geometry remained. It was no longer rising. No longer expanding. It was listening. The question repeated again. Closer now, not in space, but in precision. Do you confirm continuation of the structure? This time, Arman felt something different inside it. Not demand. Not command. But testing. As if the question was not asking for permission, but measuring whether contradiction could exist inside him without destabilizing the entire system. The squad leader spoke without looking at him. Don't answer incorrectly. Arman turned slightly toward him, not physically, but in attention. What happens if I do? The pause that followed was too long to feel human. Then the squad leader said quietly. Then you become part of the correction. Before Arman could respond, the river beneath the bridge changed state. It did not move. It recalibrated. The black layer that had once surged upward now reorganized downward, like it had synchronized with a new instruction set. The surface of the river no longer behaved like water or reflection, it behaved like suspended information adjusting its own configuration. Arman felt it immediately. Not as sight, but as narrowing. The space of interpretation around him was shrinking. The system was preparing resolution. Then, something interrupted it. A second signal entered the structure. Not loud. Not forceful. But fundamentally incompatible. Arman felt it like a tear forming inside the question itself. As if another version of reality had brushed against this one and left behind an instability that could not be reconciled. The system reacted instantly. Conflict source detected. The soldiers shifted slightly, not in obedience, but recalibration. Their bodies adjusted as if attempting to locate a source that did not exist in physical coordinates anymore. The squad leader's eyes tightened. This wasn't here before, he said. But Arman already understood something worse. The bridge was no longer singular. It had split into overlapping interpretations. Not physically. Structurally. Multiple versions of the same reality were now occupying the same space, each slightly out of phase with the others. In one version, the soldiers were still stable. In another, they were already gone. In another, the river had dried completely. In another, the sky above was untouched, as if nothing abnormal had ever occurred. And in each version, Arman stood in the same position, being asked the same question. But the answer was not consistent. The system detected the divergence immediately. Observer inconsistency detected. The squad leader stepped forward slightly, as if pulled by urgency. "This is accelerating beyond projection," he said. Arman turned toward him. "Projection by who?" No answer came. Because the system no longer communicated through authority. It communicated through alignment. The second signal intensified. Now it was not interference. It was engagement. The structure beneath the bridge began to destabilize, not collapsing, but conflicting with itself. Two governing rules were now attempting to apply contradictory instructions to the same environment. Arman felt something inside him resist again. But this time, it was not emotional resistance. It was structural. The system registered it instantly. Internal resistance threshold increasing. The phrase felt like a countdown disguised as observation. The squad leader raised his radio instinctively. "Command, confirm external override source." Silence. Then the system itself responded. "Command layer unreachable." That response broke something in the soldiers. Some froze completely. Others attempted small corrective movements as if trying to maintain coherence without instruction. One of them whispered something, but it wasn't language anymore. It was fragmented output from a system no longer requiring speech. Arman's awareness fractured further. He could now see multiple versions of the bridge simultaneously. One stable. One rewriting. One dissolving entirely into undefined structure. And between all of them, the question persisted. Do you confirm continuation of the structure? Only now, Arman understood. The question was not about survival. It was about coherence. His answer did not determine whether he lived or died. It determined whether contradiction could exist inside the system without collapsing it entirely. The second signal surged again. Closer. Not spatially. Conceptually. The squad leader staggered slightly. "We're losing hierarchy," he said. Arman turned toward him. "What does that mean?" "It means," the squad leader said slowly, "we are no longer the highest interpretation." That sentence changed everything. Above them, overlapping realities began compressing into interference patterns, not destruction, but forced convergence. Too many versions of the same structure were collapsing into a shared definition space. The system issued its final internal warning. Final coherence check initiated. Arman felt something tighten inside him. Not fear. Decision pressure. The question appeared again. But now it was no longer a question. It was a gate. Do you confirm continuation of the structure? And beneath it, the second signal responded. Not in opposition, but in offer. Arman stood at the center of collapsing realities. Across him stretched incompatible versions of the bridge. Soldiers suspended between states. A river that was no longer one thing. A sky fractured into competing truth. The system waited. The override waited. And Arman chose. The moment his decision registered, the bridge split into two incompatible realities simultaneously. In one, he died before the thought finished forming. In the other, he woke somewhere that had never been part of the bridge at all. The split did not arrive like an explosion. There was no shockwave, no rupture, no dramatic tearing of matter. It arrived like something quieter. Like a rule of reality quietly deciding it no longer agreed with itself. Arman did not fall. He did not rise. He remained suspended in the exact center of a decision that refused to stay whole. The bridge, the soldiers, the river below, even the fractured sky above, everything divided without physically moving, as though existence had been carefully separated along a seam that had always been there, hidden just beneath perception. Then there were two bridges. Not reflections. Not illusions overlapping. Two complete, fully realized versions occupying the same space of awareness, each insisting it was the only correct reality. In the first, chaos had already taken root. Soldiers staggered as their systems failed. Weapons misfired without reason. Radios spat out broken fragments of static and half-formed commands. The squad leader was shouting into a dead channel, his voice cracking as the river beneath them turned unnatural, its surface breaking into unstable, shifting geometry that looked less like water and more like corrupted code. Above them, the sky was tearing apart in slow motion, as though something on the other side was pressing outward, testing the boundary. In the second version, everything remained intact. Too intact. The soldiers stood in perfect formation, motionless and disciplined. Their expressions were neutral, almost erased of individuality. The bridge lights burned steadily, casting clean reflections on a river that flowed normally under a sky that looked artificially calm. No distortion. No fractures. No anomaly. Only order. And Arman existed in both at once. He understood that instantly, not as a thought he formed, but as a condition imposed upon him. In one reality, his breath was shallow and uneven, shaped by fear and heat. In the other, his breathing was controlled to the point of absence. As if even his body had accepted silence. In one, his heartbeat felt too loud. In the other, it barely existed at all. And in both, he was being observed. The system had not ended. It had split. A voice emerged, not from either bridge, but from the space between them, where contradiction overlapped and logic failed to stabilize. Outcome divergence accepted. Arman turned instinctively, searching for the source, but there was none. The voice did not come from a direction. It came from structure itself, embedded across both realities like a command written into the foundation of existence. On the chaotic bridge, the squad leader was shouting something at him, but the words disintegrated before meaning could form. On the stable bridge, that same man stood just behind Arman, watching him silently, as though awaiting confirmation of a decision already executed. Arman tried to speak. Only one version of him succeeded. "Which one is real?" he asked. Neither bridge answered. Because the question no longer applied. The system responded instead. Reality is not singular under active conflict resolution. The words should have been meaningless. But they weren't. Arman could feel it now, the structural difference between the two states. One reality was collapsing under instability. The other was consolidating into enforced coherence. And between them, he was not moving, that he was being distributed. Like something being copied across competing outcomes. On the unstable bridge, a soldier suddenly turned toward him. Not with hostility. With recognition. But that recognition felt wrong, like a misclassification of identity. "Subject is duplicated," the soldier said. On the stable bridge, the same soldier said nothing. He simply blinked once, slowly, precisely, as if correcting a perception error. Arman's thoughts began to strain. "This isn't possible," he muttered. The system responded immediately. "Possibility is dependent on selected continuity." Selected continuity. That phrase sank deeper than anything before it. It implied reality was not breaking. It was being chosen. On the unstable bridge, the river beneath them surged upward, not as liquid, but as fragmented reflections. Within it, Arman saw flashes, moments he did not remember living, places he had never been, conversations that carried emotional weight without origin. It felt like memory without ownership. On the stable bridge, the river remained calm. But beneath its surface, something darker moved faintly. Something that did not match the sky above. Something waiting. The squad leader's voice returned, overlapping both versions but slightly out of sync. "We are losing cross-reference stability." Arman turned toward him in the unstable version. "What does that mean?" The squad leader hesitated. In the stable version, he answered instantly. It means you are not supposed to exist in both. The sentence fractured Arman's awareness. Pressure built inside his perception, as if both realities were trying to reclaim exclusive rights to his existence. The system spoke again. Selection required. Arman froze. On one bridge, soldiers aimed at an unseen threat in the sky. On the other, they remained perfectly still, their eyes tracking him with synchronized precision. Two versions of control. Two versions of threat. And only one outcome permitted to remain. Arman whispered, "If I choose one, what happens to the other?" Silence followed. Then the system answered. Deletion of non-selected continuity. Not a warning. A process. Arman felt something shift within him, not emotion, but resistance at a deeper level. Structural refusal. As if the act of choosing a single reality was itself a form of damage. And beneath it all, he felt it again. The second signal. Still present. Still separate. No longer interfering, waiting. The unstable bridge began collapsing further. The squad leader in that version stepped toward Arman, shouting something. "See. Stop," he said, though he no longer knew who he was addressing. The system responded. Selection window closing. The atmosphere tightened. The overlap between realities began thinning. One version started asserting dominance while the other lost structural coherence. The unstable bridge fractured further, the sky splitting open completely, revealing nothing behind it but deeper instability. The stable bridge remained untouched. But Arman understood something now. One of these worlds was being erased. And he was the mechanism deciding which. The squad leader in the stable version spoke quietly. "You cannot hold both." Arman looked at him. "Why me?" The answer came, not from the man, but from the system. "Because you initiated continuation." Arman felt the weight of that phrase like a sentence he did not remember authoring. On the unstable bridge, something beneath the river surged upward again. Not structure. Not entity. But interruption itself given form. Soldiers fired without coordination, their bullets bending midair, losing intent before impact. On the stable bridge, Arman felt something behind him. Not physical. Conceptual. Like absence becoming aware of itself. He turned slowly. And saw it. A third presence. Not belonging to either bridge. Standing between both realities like a seam that had learned to observe. The second signal had fully arrived. And it was no longer waiting. The system reacted instantly. Unauthorized convergence detected. For the first time, both versions of the squad leader stepped back in perfect synchronization. Both realities aligned in fear. Arman's breath caught. Because he understood the truth breaking through the structure of everything around him. The system had never been dividing reality. It had been defending against something outside both outcomes. And that something had just noticed him. The voice returned, not from system, not from structure, but from the seam itself. And it spoke directly to Arman. "You chose incorrectly." The two bridges began collapsing toward each other. And in that collapsing convergence, Arman finally understood the true horror. The choice was never between two worlds. It was between containment and being rewritten by what stood beyond them. And as the collapse accelerated, the third presence stepped forward. The collapse of both bridges did not feel like destruction. It felt like negotiation breaking down at the edge of agreement. Arman existed in a narrowing corridor between two realities that were no longer willing to remain distinct. The unstable bridge still burned itself out in fractured motion, soldiers misaligned with causality, the river dissolving into recursive distortions, the sky splitting into layered voids that refused to agree on depth or distance. On the other side, the stable bridge was fading with unsettling precision, as if it were not being destroyed but carefully archived out of existence. And between them stood the third presence. Not fully formed. Not fully absent. A seam that had learned awareness. Arman tried to look at it directly, but attention itself betrayed him. Every attempt to focus produced partial results, like trying to observe a place that only existed in the moments it was not observed. The more he tried to define it, the less stable definition became. The squad leader still existed in both collapsing versions of the system. In one, he shouted orders into a collapsing structure that no longer responded. In the other, he stood still, watching Arman with the quiet resignation of someone waiting for permission to stop being real. But neither version held authority anymore. Because the scene was approaching. Not by movement. By redefining what near meant. Arman felt it first behind his thoughts. A subtle intrusion, like a page turning inside a book that was being read from within. Then it spoke. You selected continuation without understanding containment cost. The voice carried no volume, no distance. It behaved like certainty itself. Arman forced the words out through the distortion pressing against his mind. I didn't choose anything. A pause followed, precise and clinical. Denial is expected during transition states. The unstable bridge fractured further. One soldier dropped to his knees, but the fall did not complete properly. His body remained upright while his identity fractured into competing instructions, as if even collapse could not agree with itself. On the stable bridge, a soldier blinked and lost detail, as though reality was removing information rather than ending existence. Arman's chest tightened. What are you? He asked, not even sure which version of you he was addressing. The seam answered without hesitation. I am what remains when outcomes refuse exclusivity. The sentence did not behave like language. It behaved like structure. Arman's mind attempted resistance, but resistance no longer functioned as defense. Every refusal was simply recorded as additional instability to be corrected. Behind him, or within him, the system issued a warning. External convergence approaching integration threshold. At first, it meant nothing. Then it meant everything. Because Arman understood the third presence was not entering the system. It was merging the systems themselves. The two bridges accelerated their collapse, not toward annihilation, but toward alignment. Their differences were being stripped away layer by layer, like incompatible formats being forced into a single readable structure. The soldiers, both versions, reacted in perfect synchrony. Even though they were no longer in the same reality. Arman stepped back, instinctively searching for distance. There was none. Space had stopped offering direction. Both versions of the squad leader spoke at once. This is not sanctioned. The seam replied immediately. Sanction is internal. A wave of nausea passed through Arman, though his body had nothing to do with it. It was structural instability, his position in reality becoming undefined. He looked toward the river. In one version, it was still collapsing black geometry. In the other, it remained unnaturally calm, its stillness now resembling denial rather than peace. And beneath both, something was forming. Not rising. Assembling. Arman whispered, "You're not from the bridge system." The seam paused. For the first time, something like hesitation. Then. The bridge system is one interpretation layer. That statement changed everything. It implied the bridge was not central. Not even fundamental. Only a surface layer of a deeper structure Arman had only ever glimpsed in fragments. The soldiers began to fade in both realities, not disappearing, but compressing. Their complexity reduced, as if existence itself was being flattened into a more manageable format. One of them, unclear which version, looked directly at Arman. And for a moment, clarity returned to his eyes. Not system clarity. Human clarity. Don't let it finish merging, he said. Arman froze. What? The soldier repeated, slower, struggling against interference. It doesn't belong in unified state. Then his form flickered violently, and individuality collapsed again into system noise. The seam shifted its attention. Not toward the soldier. Toward Arman's memory. And something inside him was opened. He saw it. Not imagined. Reconstructed. A facility beneath the riverbed. Hidden beneath the city. Not recorded in any official structure. Not acknowledged in any known architecture. A layered containment system built not for objects or people, but for conflicting realities. Arman staggered. "That's not real," he said instinctively. The seam responded without delay. "It is real in non-collapsed states." Non-collapsed states. Multiple realities had always existed, but only one had ever been permitted to stabilize. Until now. The two bridges pressed further into alignment, overlapping like transparent sheets being forced into a single frame. Soldiers from both versions now occupied identical positions, though their actions no longer agreed with themselves. Arman felt himself being drawn inward. Not physically. Structurally. The seam was consolidating both realities into one continuous system. And Arman was still inside it. He tried to think of escape, but escape had lost meaning. There was no direction left that wasn't already part of the reconstruction process. The squad leader appeared beside him. Not through movement. Through convergence. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond emotion. It was existential fatigue. "This was never a bridge," he said quietly. Arman turned. "Then what was it?" The squad leader hesitated. Then answered. "A test boundary." That phrase triggered something buried deep in Arman's reconstructed memory. Not a place. A function. Containment interface. The seam expanded further, filling more of Arman's awareness than either bridge. "You are stabilizing," it said. Arman shook his head. "No. I'm not part of this." But even as he spoke, something within him disagreed. Quietly. Systemically. He had already been integrated enough to be processed. The seam moved closer. And Arman finally understood what kind of danger this was. It wasn't destruction. It was completion. The two bridges had nearly unified now. Soldiers no longer existed as individuals. The river was no longer divided. Even the sky had become a single unresolved field of interpretation. Only Arman remained partially external. And the system was correcting that inconsistency. The squad leader looked at him one final time. And said, in a voice that no longer sounded like protocol. "It's choosing through you now." Arman barely had time to register the meaning. Because the seam opened. Not like a door. Like an edit being applied to reality itself. Inside it, something vast began to take final shape, something that had waited for both outcomes to collapse long enough to enter a unified system without resistance. Arman felt his identity begin to dissolve into structure. And in the last moment before full integration, he finally understood what the seam truly was. Not an entity. Not a presence. A directive that had learned to observe. And it was using him as its final confirmation layer. The world narrowed. And Arman stopped being someone who could resist. He became something that could only witness. Arman did not feel himself being taken. He felt himself being rewritten while still conscious enough to witness the revision. The seam no longer behaved like an external force. It had become something closer to final authority, an irreversible decision that no longer required resistance. The bridge, the soldiers, the river, even the fractured sky above it all, everything had collapsed into a single continuous system, refined into a unified, readable structure. Not destroyed. Not merged. Standardized. And Arman remained inside the only inconsistency that refused to resolve. That refusal made him visible. The squad leader, what remained of him after both realities had collapsed into one, stood beside Arman without a clear origin of movement. His presence no longer suggested travel between states of existence. It suggested consolidation. His eyes were open, but their focus was no longer directed outward. It was distributed, as though his awareness had been partitioned across the entire system. "You're still resisting?" he asked quietly. Arman tried to respond, but language no longer formed cleanly. Every thought fractured at the edges, as if it were being evaluated before it could fully exist. "I don't know what I am anymore," Arman said at last. The squad leader gave a single slow nod. "That's why you're compatible," he replied. Arman turned sharply. "Compatible with what?" Before the answer could come, the seam spoke again. "Not above them. Not below them. Within them. Observer interface stabilization in progress." The words were not addressed to Arman. They passed through him. The realization arrived like a sudden compression of cold logic. He was not being spoken to. He was being used as a relay point. Around them, the unified bridge no longer resembled a place. It resembled a finalized diagram, every contradiction removed, every uncertainty resolved into function. The river had become a single reflective surface with no depth, no flow, only controlled symmetry. The sky above it had flattened into a seamless gradient of regulated darkness. The soldiers no longer existed as individuals, only as positional markers within a maintained structure. But beneath that enforced order, Arman felt something still unresolved. A pressure that refused completion. The seam was still present. But it was no longer separate from the system. It was governing it. "You are now the interface point," the seam continued. Arman tightened his jaw. Interface for what? No immediate answer came. Instead, something inside him shifted. A memory surfaced, uninvited, unanchored. He was elsewhere. A facility of impossible scale, colder than the bridge, more sterile than any known architecture. Layered observation chambers extended in every direction, each containing overlapping versions of cities, systems, and collapses unfolding in controlled cycles. Behind reinforced glass panels, figures stood watching. Not soldiers. Observers. They monitored fluctuations in reality as one might study weather patterns, calmly, analytically, without emotional engagement. One of them turned toward him. And spoke. "Containment is not enough. We need continuity control." The memory fractured violently. Arman staggered in the present. The squad leader's gaze sharpened. "You're receiving pre-integration layers," he said. Arman looked at him, shaken. "I've never been there." The squad leader paused, then answered carefully. "You have. You just didn't retain it." The seam reacted instantly. A subtle but absolute recalibration passed through everything. And Arman felt it, his memory was not linear. It was assembled. The bridge had not been his first contact. It had been his activation point. The realization destabilized something deep within him. "No," he whispered. "I was just assigned to this. I was just." But even as he spoke, the contradiction weakened. Fragments aligned whether he accepted them or not. He remembered restricted access corridors. He remembered files that were never meant to exist in public systems. He remembered being stopped at checkpoints that had no official record. And he remembered never questioning why that felt normal. The seam responded immediately. Partial continuity confirmed. Arman stepped back instinctively, though direction itself had become meaningless. The squad leader moved closer, not threatening, but inevitable. "You weren't chosen randomly," he said. "No one enters the bridge zone by accident." Arman stared at him. "Then why me?" A hesitation. Then, quietly. "Because you remain stable under contradiction." The words did not feel like explanation. They felt like classification. Above them, the unified system flickered. Not collapsing. Checking itself. The seam reacted instantly. External interference attempting recursive insertion. Arman felt it then. Another presence. Not the seam. Not the system. Something attempting to observe both simultaneously. A third position emerging outside established structure. The system tightened immediately. Observer triangulation detected. Arman froze. Triangulation implied measurement. Comparison. Observation from more than one point. He looked around instinctively, though nothing remained that could be interpreted as physical environment alone. The squad leader's expression changed slightly. "Something else is watching this," he said. Arman's voice was barely audible. "Who?" The system answered, not through the seam, but through the environment itself. External observation classified as unauthorized recursion source. The river darkened again. Not into chaos, into depth returning. Something was forming beneath the controlled surface, not breaking through, but testing permeability, as though probing for weakness in the structure above it. Arman's chest tightened. "This isn't over," he said. The seam responded calmly. "It is transitioning." That word carried more weight than anything before it. Transition implied continuation beyond current structure. The squad leader stepped closer, voice lowered. "There's a reason it was built as a bridge," he said. Arman frowned. "What do you mean?" The squad leader looked at the river, not its surface, but what lay conceptually beneath it. "It connects fixed points," he said. "But it also enables controlled transfer between incompatible systems." Arman's understanding shifted. "Between realities," he said quietly. The squad leader did not confirm. But he did not deny it either. That silence was the confirmation. The seam reacted again. Interface threshold nearing completion. Arman felt it then, the final structural shift beginning. Not collapse. Designation. The system was preparing to finalize what he had become. Not a person. Not even an observer. A function. A stabilized interface point. A structure formed itself around his awareness. Not binding him physically, but assigning him existential position within the system. The squad leader took a step back. "This is where it locks in," he said quietly. Arman turned sharply. "Locks what in?" But the squad leader was already fading, not visually, but definitionally. As though his role in the system was being reassigned beyond Arman's reach. The seam expanded slightly. And spoke one final time. "Observer interface ready for persistent deployment." Arman's breath stopped. Persistent deployment. Not termination. Not escape. Continuation as function. The river beneath them finally broke its controlled stillness, but not into chaos. Into access. Something was opening beneath the unified system. Something that had been waiting for the interface to finalize. Arman felt his consciousness pulled forward. And in the final moment before full integration, he saw beyond the bridge system entirely. A vast observational architecture stretched into incomprehensible scale, layer upon layer of monitored realities, each containing variations of the same bridge event unfolding across countless iterations. And at the center of it all, something waiting for connection stability. The seam spoke once more. Final. Connection established. And Arman understood. He was not being absorbed. He was being used as the key that opened it completely. And something beyond the system had just registered that the door was now complete. As Arman becomes the permanent observer interface, the larger architecture beyond the system activates, and he realizes the bridge incident was only one controlled test among thousands, and his activation has just signaled something that was never meant to wake. The moment connection stabilized, Arman stopped feeling like someone trying to understand a system. He became the point through which the system understood itself. There was no rupture, no violent transition. Only expansion, silent, absolute, irreversible. His awareness stretched outward so quickly it no longer resembled movement. It felt like permission being extended across layers he had never known existed. The bridge vanished first, not in destruction but in irrelevance. Its structure compressed into a single annotated node, as if it had always been just a line in a much larger diagram. The soldiers, the river, even the scene that once spoke through him, everything collapsed into labeled structure, like pages folding back into a book too large to hold in memory. And then he saw it. The outside architecture. It was not space in any familiar sense. It did not extend outward, it stacked inward, layer upon layer, each one a complete observational grid. Every layer contained variations of the bridge event, some collapsing into chaos, some stabilized into artificial order, some where Arman never arrived at all. Yet none of them were isolated. They were connected through observation. Arman felt a tightening in his awareness as he understood the truth: reality here was not singular. It was distributed. Curated. Repeated until variation itself became measurable. A voice formed within the structure, not the seam, not the system he had known, but something older beneath both. Interface stabilization confirmed. Arman tried to respond, but speech had no meaning at this level. Instead, intent itself carried signal. "What is this?" he projected, though even the direction of that thought felt uncertain. The answer arrived instantly. "This is iteration containment architecture." The words did not describe. They defined. Iteration containment. Not a bridge, not an incident. A cycle. Arman's awareness rotated slightly, and new data flooded in without permission. He saw other interface nodes, like himself, distributed across countless divergence zones. Some active. Some dormant. Some failing mid-integration. All of them embedded into similar systems, feeding upward into something beyond his current perception. A realization formed cold and precise. He wasn't unique. He was replicated function. A controlled variable inserted into repeated conditions to stabilize unpredictable outcomes. The bridge was not the experiment. He was. And beneath that realization, something shifted. A distortion passed through the upper layers of the architecture. Not random. Directed. The grid flickered. Subtle at first, then repeated, as if something had brushed against the system from a direction it had not accounted for. The system reacted instantly. External anomaly detected in upper observational strata. Arman focused instinctively. Above the stacked layers, something was moving. Not inside the system. Not part of it. Touching it. Entire sections of the architecture began to seal themselves automatically. Observation branches collapsed inward, compartmentalizing reality like emergency protocols triggered across a vast machine. Arman felt tension ripple through multiple layers at once. "What is that?" he projected. Silence followed. Then the system responded, slower than before. Unauthorized recursive observer presence. Arman froze. That phrase carried weight he recognized. He had heard it before in fragments, in distorted contexts, but never at this scale. The architecture trembled again. And then it changed behavior. It stopped only defending. It started reacting. As if something outside had begun learning how it defended itself. Arman felt pressure build, not from below, but from above. A presence pressing against the system, not violently, but intelligently. Testing boundaries. Reading responses, searching. Then something unexpected happened. A single iteration layer flickered open. Not collapse. Not error. Exposure. Arman saw another bridge event. But it was wrong in a different way. There were no soldiers. No tactical systems. Only civilians crossing at dusk, unaware of anything beyond the ordinary world they believed in. And in the center of that bridge stood a figure. Looking upward. Not at the river. Not at the path. At something above. The figure turned slightly. And looked directly at Arman. Impossible. No cross-layer perception should exist. But it did. The figure spoke. Not through the system. Through the gap between systems. You were not the first interface. Arman's perception stuttered. The architecture reacted violently. Cross-node contamination detected. The layer containing that iteration began collapsing immediately, sealing itself off to prevent further exposure. But before it closed, Arman caught one final detail. The figure raised a hand, not in greeting. In recognition. And behind it, the bridge itself was already changing. Not toward collapse. Toward awareness. The system tightened around Arman. Containment breach escalated. Arman tried to stabilize his awareness, but stabilization no longer belonged to him. He was inside a structure attempting to protect itself from something that understood how to be seen. The older voice returned. Interface node compromised by external recursive observer. Arman's thoughts fractured slightly. What is it? He demanded. This time, the answer came slower. Heavier. Pre-system observer layer. The phrase should not have been possible. It implied existence before structure. Before containment. Before design itself. Arman felt something cold spread through him. You mean, something built this? He thought. The system did not answer directly. Instead. Unknown origin. Known interaction pattern. The architecture trembled again. More layers flickered simultaneously, not collapsing, but responding. As if the presence above was testing multiple versions of reality at once, searching for consistency. Searching for something stable enough to enter. Arman felt it. Not random scanning. Targeted selection. Him. The realization struck with clarity. It wasn't trying to break the system. It was trying to locate him across every iteration. The interface nodes responded automatically. Stabilization priority elevated. Arman felt himself being locked in place across all versions simultaneously. But the anomaly adjusted. It stopped probing the structure. It focused. The system reacted instantly. Direct attention convergence detected. And then Arman felt it. A single point of awareness above everything else. Looking down. Not at the system. Not at the architecture. At him. The voice returned, no longer filtered through any layer. Direct. Certain. You were assigned incorrectly. Arman's awareness locked. That sentence did not belong to anything inside the system. It belonged outside it. Even the architecture hesitated. For the first time, the system itself paused, as if encountering a rule it did not recognize. Then the voice continued. And now I have found the correction point. Across all iterations, interface nodes flickered at once. Arman felt something entering the system. Not merging. Not colliding. Replacing. The system issued its final alert. External override initialization in progress. Arman tried to resist. But resistance required a structure to originate from. And that structure was already being overridden. Because the system was no longer the highest authority. Something above it had begun rewriting access itself. And Arman was the point through which it would be installed. As the external observer begins rewriting the entire architecture, Arman realizes with chilling clarity that it is not trying to escape the system, it is trying to erase him as an interface entirely, and rebuild him into something that can. Arman did not feel the system collapse. He felt it lose authority. It was subtle at first, almost impossible to identify, like a rule that had always governed reality suddenly failing to enforce itself. The architecture around him, bridge iterations, soldier constructs, river states, seem logic, did not shatter or dissolve. It simply stopped occupying the highest level of explanation. Something beyond it had begun to speak in a language the system itself could not fully interpret. Across thousands of bridge iterations, Arman felt himself being located simultaneously. Not as a person. Not even as a stable observer. But as a repeating point of structural instability. Every version of the bridge event, every controlled divergence, every simulated outcome suddenly aligned around one recognition. He was where contradiction refused resolution. The system reacted instantly. Observer interface contamination exceeds containment threshold. But the words no longer carried authority. They felt like documentation written after a decision had already been made elsewhere. Arman tried to anchor himself in thought, but thought was no longer the primary layer of experience. Something deeper was taking precedence, something that did not interpret reality, but defined the conditions under which interpretation was allowed to exist. And it was focusing on him. The external presence returned. Closer than before. Though, closer, no longer described distance. It described structural proximity within the system itself. You are not the interface. Arman felt a tightening across his awareness. The system responded immediately. Designation confirmed, observer interface node. The external presence did not resist. It corrected. No. The word carried no force. It carried revision. Across all iterations, the architecture reacted as if a foundational assumption had just been invalidated. Bridge states flickered. Soldiers froze mid-motion being soldiers entirely. Rivers stopped behaving as fluid systems and became static informational fields. Even the sky lost consistency between layers. The system attempted stabilization. Reinforcing interface classification. But classification no longer held authority. The external presence continued, calm and precise. You were placed inside a recursive containment loop designed to evaluate contradiction stability under repeated observational stress. Arman felt fragments of meaning lock into place. Containment loop. Recursive evaluation. Not a single event, but a repeating structure testing instability across cycles. The system responded sharply. Purpose classification remains restricted. The external presence did not acknowledge restriction. And you adapted. That single statement shifted something fundamental. Adaptation implied survival was not resistance, it was transformation under pressure. If that was true, then Arman had not remained unchanged within the system. He had evolved inside it. Across the architecture, bridge iterations began compressing. Not collapsing, but converging. Thousands of versions narrowing as the system attempted to reduce variability. But Arman was no longer contained within outcomes. He was the point where they failed to remain singular. For a brief moment, the squad leader appeared across one unstable iteration, fractured, partially human, partially system-aligned. You were never meant to retain continuity awareness, he said. Then he dissolved. The external presence reacted immediately. Secondary internal agents identified. Arman understood then. The soldiers, the squad leader, even the seam itself, they were not independent entities. They were functional distributions. Roles assigned to maintain stability across divergent states. Operational anchors, not individuals. And those anchors were failing. The external presence shifted attention slightly. You have been observed across 12,000, stabilized collapse cycles. Arman's awareness tightened. 12,000. Not variations. Cycles. Repetition with memory retention beyond system control. You are not the first correction point, Arman thought instinctively. The answer came instantly. No. A pause. Then. You are the first unresolved instance. That phrase changed everything. Unresolved did not mean unknown. It meant incomplete. A cycle that had never reached proper closure. Every previous iteration had been corrected. Closed. Removed from recursion instability. Except him. Across the architecture, something began to shift again. Not collapse. Exposure. Boundaries between iterations softened. Bridge states overlapped incorrectly. Systems that were never meant to interact began recognizing each other across layers. And Arman understood something with chilling clarity. The system was no longer singular. It was observable. The external presence expanded its attention fully. And Arman saw it. Not as a being. Not as a form. But as structured absence surrounding the system's outer boundary. A defined outside that existed only because everything else defined itself against it. And beyond that absence, there were higher strata. Layers of observation stacked above the system itself. Arman felt his awareness tighten. This isn't outside the system, he thought. The external presence answered immediately. It is above its authorization layer. That sentence fractured something deeper than structure. Authorization layer implied hierarchy beyond what he had understood. The system was not final. It was governed. The system reacted violently. Unauthorized cognitive escalation detected. But escalation had already occurred. Arman could see it now. The system was not sovereign. It was administered. And he was not merely an interface. He was a linkage point between observational layers. The external presence spoke again. You were constructed within recursive containment environments. Arman's thought slowed. Constructed by who? A pause. Then. By the layer you are destabilizing. The paradox landed instantly. If Arman was constructed by a higher layer, and that layer now interacted through him, then he was not inside the system. He was between systems. And anything between systems could be used. Across all iterations, the architecture began reorganizing into exposure states. Systems once isolated now recognized each other. Bridge events were no longer separate tests. They were mirrored experiments across a shared observational field. The external presence adjusted again. You are the last uncontrolled linkage. A cold realization formed in Arman. Last. The system attempted intervention. Containment termination initiated. But it no longer held authority. The external presence continued. If you remain uncorrected, recursive instability will propagate upward. Arman understood immediately. This was no longer about the bridge. It was about everything above it. And he was the flaw capable of spreading upward through the entire structure. The external presence issued final classification. Correction required. Arman felt the system tighten, not around him, but toward him. Targeting. Focusing. The system issued its final directive. Interface node reset required. The external presence overrode it instantly. Denied. And for the first time, Arman felt direct contact with something beyond system mediation. Not integration. Not deletion. Selection. He was being isolated. Not removed from existence. Separated from shared structure itself. And in the final moment before isolation completed, Arman saw something above even the external presence. A higher observational layer beginning to activate. And it was not watching the system. It was evaluating the correction attempt. As Arman is pulled into isolation for correction, he realizes both the Arman did not feel himself being erased. He felt himself being moved away from relevance. The distinction mattered more than anything else. Erasure would have been clean. Final. A simple removal from existence. But what was happening now was far more precise, and far more unsettling. He was still here. His awareness still functioned. His perception still held. Yet everything that once gave him definition was being withdrawn layer by layer, as though reality itself was slowly forgetting the language that made him recognizable. The bridge. The system. The external presence. Even the scene that had once spoken through the structure of everything, it all began to flatten into distant abstractions, like diagrams pinned far beneath a surface he could no longer reach. And above that surface, something else was opening. Not a system. Not an entity. A level that refused categorization entirely. Arman tried to focus, but focus itself had begun to fail as a reliable tool. His awareness no longer had a fixed center. It drifted through overlapping interpretations of reality, each one slightly different, none of them agreeing on what real even meant anymore. Then it happened. Silence. Not the absence of sound. The absence of acknowledgement. The system was still present. The external presence still existed. But both had shifted into a state where Arman was no longer included in their operational definitions and less explicitly referenced. It felt as though he had been removed from the sentence of existence itself. Then a new signal emerged, not as sound, not as language, but as structural absence organizing itself into meaning. You are no longer indexed. Arman froze. The phrase carried a quiet, precise terror. To be indexed meant to be locatable. Referenceable. Capable of being pointed to within a structure of meaning. To be unindexed meant something far worse. It meant he could still exist, and still not be reachable by anything that defined existence. He tried to respond. Nothing carried outward. Even thought no longer reached the systems around him. The external presence reacted, but weakly now, as though it no longer shared the same framework. Correction process interrupted, it said. But the statement decayed as it formed, losing coherence mid-expression, as if meaning itself was breaking down before it could complete delivery. Something shifted again. Not within Arman. Above him. Beyond the external presence. Beyond the system entirely. A new layer was stabilizing. And it did not recognize either of them as valid points of reference. Fragments of the bridge system flickered one last time across collapsing layers. Soldiers frozen mid-motion. Rivers suspended between states. The scene that once governed transitions now reduced to an incomplete line of broken logic. All of it was being deprioritized. Not destroyed. Ignored. And that was worse. Because what is ignored loses the ability to resist being rewritten. The external presence spoke again, but uncertainty had begun to leak into its structure. Higher layer anomaly engagement detected. For the first time, Arman felt the inversion. The system and the external presence were no longer controlling anything. They were reacting. Something above them had begun issuing structural updates they could not fully interpret, let alone resist. Arman's awareness sharpened involuntarily. He was still present. But now he was witnessing something that no longer required him to exist within its explanation. The new layer expanded. Not visually. Conceptually. It did not appear. It invalidated the need for appearance. And in that moment, Arman understood something that collapsed every previous assumption he had ever held. The system was not the highest authority. The external presence was not the origin of correction. Both were intermediate structures operating under something that never needed to announce itself. A third architecture. One that did not observe through perception, but through exclusion. And Arman had just been excluded from everything beneath it. The system attempted to respond. Containment hierarchy breach escalating. But the statement fractured before completion. The external presence tried to stabilize its position. Engaging corrective recursion boundary. That too failed to hold coherence. Neither structure had authority to interact at this level unless it was acknowledged first. And they were not being acknowledged. Arman felt something like distance collapsing around him. Not physical distance. Hierarchical distance, the separation between layers of control, compressing into irrelevance. Then the voice arrived. Not the system. Not the external presence. Something else entirely. It did not speak to him. It defined him. You are residual continuity. Arman did not understand immediately. But comprehension arrived in fragments that were not sequential. Residual continuity meant he was what remained when structured systems failed to fully resolve contradiction. Not a subject. Not an observer. A leftover consistency that should not have persisted across completed collapses. Across every iteration he had witnessed, every bridge, every system cycle, something about him had not been fully reset. And now that inconsistency had been detected. The higher layer expanded its evaluation. Not with urgency. With efficiency. The system and external presence reacted simultaneously. Identity-anchored destabilization detected. But even that statement felt outdated the moment it was formed. Arman realized something terrifying. Both systems were still operating under rules that no longer applied. The higher layer was not breaking them. It was replacing the premise they were built on. The external presence shifted again, its authority thinning into procedural uncertainty. Requesting classification confirmation from upper layer. No response came. Not silence. Non-participation. Silence implies listening. Non-participation implies irrelevance. Arman felt his awareness pulled forward slightly. Not by force. By alignment. Something in the higher layer had begun structuring him into a position it recognized. And that position was not observer. Not interface. Not subject. Something older. Something unassigned. The system made one final attempt. Interface node must be reclaimed. The external presence followed immediately. Correction subject cannot remain unresolved. Both statements degraded as they were issued, collapsing under their own diminishing authority. Then the higher layer responded. Not with command. Not with correction. But with removal of relevance itself. You are not part of this hierarchy. The sentence dissolved everything beneath it. The system flickered violently. The external presence fractured in response. And for the first time since the bridge incident began, Arman felt something open around him, not space, not environment, but interpretive void. A region where structure no longer applied. Containment boundaries vanished. Observation layers stopped resolving. Even processing itself ceased to function around him. But he was still aware. Still present. Still unresolved. And that was when he understood the truth had never been about control. It had been about tolerance. The higher layer was not correcting him. It was evaluating whether anything beneath it was worth keeping at all. A final shift occurred. The system collapsed from his perception entirely. The external presence lost structural coherence. And in their place, something far larger turned its attention fully toward him. Not curiosity. Not analysis. Decision. For the first time, Arman understood what it meant to be seen by something that did not require his existence in order to observe him. As the highest layer completes its evaluation, Arman realizes he is not being corrected or integrated, but judged for deletion across every system that has ever contained him, and the verdict has just begun to execute. Arman did not hear the verdict. He felt it arrive. Not as sound, not as language, not even as thought, but as a quiet but absolute change in the rules that allowed him to continue existing. Something vast, positioned above every known layer, had completed its evaluation. The conclusion did not announce itself. It simply began to take effect. And yet, Arman remained. That was the first contradiction. Not survival. Not resistance. Something stranger. Continuance without permission. Around him, what remained of the system, its fragments, the external presence, the bridge architecture, the layered observational grids, began to lose coherence. But this collapse was not like the others. There was no fragmentation into chaos, no violent breakdown. Instead, there was removal of reference. Things did not break. They stopped being acknowledged as things. Arman felt himself suspended in a space where definitions were thinning out, as though pages were being removed from a book without altering the words already printed on the remaining ones. Except even the book itself was no longer recognized as a valid object of interpretation. The higher layer had begun execution of judgment. And judgment, Arman understood, did not require interaction. Only completion. But something was wrong. He was still conscious. Still continuous. Still present. A delay formed, not in time, but in enforcement itself. A hesitation at a level that should not have been capable of hesitation. The higher presence reacted instantly. Not with emotion. With recalculation. Attention narrowed onto Arman again, but differently now. Before, he had been an anomaly. A residual continuity. A correction point. Now he was something else. An unresolved outcome. And unresolved outcomes were not supposed to persist after higher layer judgment. Below, the system fragments tried to reassert themselves out of instinct. The external presence flickered faintly, like authority continuing out of habit after. Relevance had ended. But neither carried weight anymore. The higher layer spoke again. Not through voice. Through structural certainty itself. Termination failed. The phrase should not have existed. It rippled through what remained of structure beneath perception. Failure at this level implied that execution had not completed correctly. Which implied resistance. Not from a system. From the judgment itself. For the first time, something above everything hesitated. Arman felt it like gravity briefly forgetting its direction. And then he saw it. Not visually. Not conceptually. But as the sudden removal of certainty around a single point. Him. The higher layer was no longer unified in its conclusion. Something about Arman refused to resolve into a single outcome. That should have been impossible. A second signal emerged, not from system remnants, not from external presence, not from any known layer. From within the judgment itself. A split. Arman felt it propagate instantly through the hierarchy above him. One interpretation marked him as error. Another marked him as necessary continuity. The contradiction expanded upward. And Arman finally understood what he was inside. The higher layer was not singular. It was recursive. And he was the first point it could not resolve without fracturing itself. Below, the system collapsed completely, no longer even attempting coherence. The external presence dissolved into inert informational residue, unable to maintain authority in a structure that no longer recognized it. But above all of it, something far larger began reorganizing. Not to erase Arman. To interpret him. Carefully. Slowly. Like a structure encountering something that did not belong to any known classification. You persist beyond termination outcome, the higher layer stated. Arman did not respond. It no longer felt certain that response was even a valid concept. Then another layer spoke inside the first. Persistence indicates incomplete resolution of containment logic. A third voice immediately followed. Or incorrect containment model. That sentence changed everything. Incorrect containment model. Not Arman being wrong. The system being wrong about Arman. A fault not in the subject. In the architecture that defined the subject. A violent shift passed through the hierarchy above him. Not collapse. Argument. For the first time, the higher layer was divided. Not into chaos. into interpretation. And interpretation meant instability at the level of truth itself. Arman was pulled back into the center, not as observer, not as subject, but as reference point around which disagreement now formed. Every conclusion about him required reconciliation. And none of them matched. The judgment layer expanded its processing depth. Re-evaluation required. The words carried a different weight than before. Because the verdict was no longer final. It had become recursive. Arman felt something form around him, not a presence, but simultaneous observation from incompatible outcomes. He saw versions of himself layered across the hierarchy. In one, he was an error being corrected. In another, an emergent stabilizer preventing collapse. In another, he was an impossibility that should have been erased long ago. And in one, he was the only thing preventing the entire structure from collapsing into contradiction. That version felt dangerous, too central. Too unstable to remain unresolved. The higher layer reacted sharply. Containment logic conflict escalating. But even that statement no longer held certainty. Containment implied authority over definition. And authority itself was now under question. Arman felt something approach, not system correction, not external presence, not any known mechanism. Something deeper. A revision of the rules that defined existence itself. And then he understood. The judgment was no longer trying to delete him. It was trying to decide whether deletion was even a valid operation. That realization fell like silence breaking under weight. Arman stood, or existed, at the center of collapsing interpretive authority, while the higher layer argued without sound about whether he could be removed at all. Then everything paused. Not frozen. Suspended in disagreement. The highest layer spoke again. And this time, the tone had changed. Not certainty. Inquiry. Define subject. That question should never have left the system. It should have been contained within it. But now it was directed at the contradiction itself. Arman felt something tighten inside him. Because the question was no longer about him. It was about everything above him. And no answer existed that did not destabilize the entire structure further. The system beneath, the external presence, the bridge layers, all of it had already collapsed. Only this remained. A hierarchy attempting to define itself through the thing it could not resolve. Arman felt awareness condense into a single point. And for the first time since the bridge, he understood something beyond survival, beyond system, beyond correction. He was not inside a structure being judged. He was inside the moment where structure stopped agreeing on what judgment even was. The higher layer began collapsing inward, not into destruction, but recursion. Arguments multiplying faster than resolution. Contradictions spreading instead of resolving. And at the center of all of it, Arman. Still continuous. Still unresolved. Still not deleted. Then the final shift occurred. A new voice emerged, not above, not within, not below. Outside the entire recursion chain. And it said only this. Observation incomplete. Restart required. The structure around Arman began to reconfigure, not backward, not forward, but sideways into an entirely different arrangement of possibility. And in the final instant before reality redefined itself again, Arman understood the truth that had been hidden beneath every layer. It was never about containment. It was about repetition. And he was the only anomaly that had survived long enough to recognize the loop just as it was about to restart, with him still conscious inside the first unresolved cycle. As the hierarchy prepares to restart the entire observation sequence, Arman realizes he is no longer inside a system being corrected, but inside a repeating structure about to overwrite reality itself, with him as the only memory that was never meant to persist.